Make sure everything is working okay. Can you see the little recording icon?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect. Cool. I always make the first minute of any recording just sort of like a mic check, low pressure introduction to whatever. So, yeah, this is Nick White with episode number, I think 7 of the Nick White Does a Podcast, which is soon to be renamed to either Space Apes or Lab Rats or possibly something else. So if any of y'all listening to this have suggestions, feel free to reach out and get in contact with me. I'm very happy to have on today James Simpkins, who I just went on to his podcast, which is called Primitive Accumulation.
Yeah, that's
correct?
Right. Yeah.
And we had a great chat there. A little bit about IQ and its importance or utility or lack thereof in relation to imposter syndrome and sort of roles in life and PhDs and whatnot. And James has been studying for a long time in graduate school now, Ballistic Missile Defense, which is something that's very outside my wheelhouse, but obviously involves a lot of interesting game theory and rocket science and physics and also policy making. So you were nice enough to send me a paper, which I read, and I was hoping we could use this time to have you share your thoughts on that and let me ask you a few questions. And I think this is going to be a very interesting and wide-ranging conversation. So, James, is there any place you'd like to start first?
Before I came on the podcast this afternoon, I was just thinking, going back over some of my thoughts in my thesis, and I thought, well, how much exactly does it cost to get a bullet to hit a bullet? Which is basically what ballistic missile defense is. You're trying to get one missile to shoot down an incoming nuclear missile.
Uh-oh. Did you freeze? All right, we're back after some technical difficulties. We had a screen freeze. So, yeah, James, start us out from the top. You're hitting a bullet with another bullet.
Yeah, before I came on, I had this thought about, exactly how much does it cost to get a bullet to hit another bullet, which is basically what's happening with ballistic missile defense. You are firing one missile to hit an incoming nuclear attack from a foreign country, let's say Iran or North Korea. And again, it's a bit more difficult than that, because in reality, a bullet from a high-powered rifle is traveling at, let's say, 4 kilometers a second. An incoming ICBM is coming at you at 7 kilometers a second. So it's much faster. There are various figures out there. I'll go with a conservative one from the Congressional Budget Office. This is from the kind of period that I'm studying. This was announced in 2002. That alone is $235 billion to make that system work. That's how much they've been spending on that. The thing that fascinates me about ballistic missile defense, it is the most expensive military technology in history, and it seems like no one knows about it. We all know about nuclear weapons, but we do not know, or many people don't seem to know about ballistic missile defense. This huge network of systems that are in place across North America, partly in the UK, across NATO, in Europe, different places. It's been expanding and growing for years, and it seems to pass. It goes right under the radar, so to speak. People don't know about this system, and it has this potential to, in effect, if you believe the people that advocate ballistic missile defense, to end nuclear war.
Right.
if we could get the big powers on side, China, Russia, etc., and the sort of rogue states, as sometimes called, North Korea, Iran, can be kept at a low number of nuclear missiles, then ballistic missile defense might just work. It's capable of shooting down, let's say, a handful of incoming nuclear missiles. So if North Korea's got about half a dozen, then what's in place now, sort of on the west coast of America, is enough to counteract that, probably.
Right, and I read in the paper that the missile defense system, it basically uses the kinetic impact of hitting the bullet with another bullet to, from my understanding, prevent it from reaching its target.
Yeah.
But that doesn't trigger the nuclear explosion. There's no system that says, if you don't reach your target, just explode on your own and, screw up wherever place you happen to be passing over.
Yeah, well, definitely in the period that I was looking at, and I believe until today as well, yeah, it's just sheer brute impact. The interceptor missile does not have any explosives on it. It's just, it looks pretty weird. It looks like the Hubble Space Telescope. Mm-hmm. It's just kind of a rocket motor with a sort of metal cylinder on the front, and the cylinder just collides with the incoming nuclear missile and causes it to disintegrate instantly because of the high speed. Of course, if you happen to be under that debris, some nuclear, some fragments of the nuclear radiation from the radioactive material that is inside the nuclear bomb might rain down on you, but it's not an explosion as such.
And there's not that much material in those ICBMs.
No.
It's like on the order of maybe not grams, maybe like less than a kilogram, a couple kilograms. What would you say in an ICBM?
I'm not sure about that. I couldn't give you the figures on the actual weight of the nuclear material that's inside, but another aspect of that is that if most of these impacts would be intended to take place outside of the Earth's atmosphere, so again you've got the you've got the heat effects of re-entry on whatever debris came down.
Okay. Yeah, my understanding is that all the heavy parts are the liquid fuel and the rocket casing.
Yeah.
And that there's so much potential energy in the mass of the uranium that that's not the majority part of the missile,
no.
Unlike conventional warheads.
Hmm.
So you are essentially optimistic about the potential for ballistic missile defense to end one of the greatest specters of the 20th and 21st century, which is like a nuclear war, a hot nuclear war, which would be absolutely devastating. But you seem to be surprised that very few people have heard of it. I mean, I know you mentioned in your article the Star Wars, so named by Reagan.
Yeah.
That was about my limit of understanding of ballistic missile defense. I considered the possibility that we still had some, but I don't know how much it had expanded.
Well, my period of expertise, or knowledge, should I say, is within 97 to 2010, and that's because I'm looking at the last Labour government in the UK. Just going back to the first point that you made there about could this system basically do away with mutually assured destruction. Now, this is where the politics comes into it and where it gets interesting, because there is a certain trend in, let's say, if I'm bringing this back to my thesis a little bit, and it also applies to the Democrats in America, there is a certain trend in thinking that this money, the amount of money, if a conservative estimate, $230 billion, this money is an absolute waste of money on this system. And what would be better would be to spend it on sort of international development and thereby reduce the, you know, if you want to use that vernacular, draining the swamp, let's say. If we spend this on poor countries around the world, international development and diplomacy with countries like Iran and North Korea, then this would be way more effective than building a new military system. On the other hand, there are other people sort of on the liberal left, let's say, within the Labour Party from this area and within the Democrats in America, who say, no, this is a really good system. If we have this, then we can reduce our nuclear weapons. We won't need as many. If we can shoot some down, this is never going to be able to stop Russia or China. You know, they can just keep building thousands. But maybe we can get them on side. Maybe we can share this technology with them. Maybe we can work through treaties such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, etc., and get them on side. And then all we need to worry about is the rogue states, and this will deal with the rogue states. For example, even in the mid-2000s, on the west coast of America, there were a handful of these ground-based interceptors set up sort of on the west coast near Alaska and in California, and rudimentary systems, you know, a handful of missiles from North Korea, they could probably, sorry, from North Korea, if we're talking about the West Coast, they could probably deal with that. So in a sense, the US does have some kind of protection against North Korea right now.
So it's interesting. One of the perspectives that I learned that was really influential for me when talking about, say, global warming was, it's a question of how much money should we spend on potential world-ending disasters. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's a lot of people that want to spend a lot of money on global warming. I think the UN came out with like 100 proposals for mitigating. But there's this interesting, I think he's an economist named, I think his name is Bjorn Lambert, where he analyzed, and it was basically to say, what is the most cost-effective way to spend the money on this problem? And, you know, things like converting all vehicles to electric vehicles were not as high as things that were sort of non-intuitive, like making birth control readily available to everyone in the world, or like, you know, educating all populations to a certain standard level, which I found very interesting. But then of course, no one wants to talk about nuclear energy in the US because it's got this sort of specter around it, even though I like to say this thing where like Chernobyl could potentially be the greatest commercial for how safe nuclear energy is, because even though it was a horrible disaster that eventually got contained, if you tally up all of the deaths from nuclear energy in comparison to coal or other types, it's like fractions of a percent that nuclear has. They're just way scarier. Like nobody pays attention when people slowly die of, like, you know, black lung or pollution, because they're not scary deaths. They happen quietly in a hospital somewhere. But 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and this, you know, we still have people in the older generation who grew up doing those nuclear drills where they hid under their desk, and that's you know, very emotional and scary. Even though I read a National Geographic many years ago when I was a kid, where they said, okay, if you wanted to power New York with alternative renewable energy, you could do it with like 100 square kilometers of solar panels, like 300 square kilometers of wind, or 2 nuclear power plants. Yeah. Which goes to show the energy density. And that was with old school wind, solar, and nuclear. So wind and solar have gotten better, but it hasn't gotten so much better that you can power all of New York with 2 solar panels, and it'll never be that energy dense. Whereas nuclear, people talk about power plants like we're still using the technology used in Chernobyl. That's like saying we shouldn't use computers because punch cards are a pain in the ass to work with. It's like, no. We have like a MacBook Pro now version of nuclear power plants, the thorium salt stuff with no risk of runaway reactions. We have some nuclear power plants that consume the spent fuel of older plants. So you can imagine someone pushing it forward, like we should decommission these old, riskier plants and install these new ones. And to me, what's most interesting is some of them run on the fuel that are used to be put into nuclear warheads. And so to me, because I'm very pro nuclear energy, I think it would be great to expand nuclear energy with the 2 leading points being, this is how we can strategically decrease the number of nuclear warheads, like power the globe and maybe step back from the brink of total annihilation. And then also clean up some of the old spent waste. But sorry, I've made this very long-winded. So the point about like how, if suppose the entire planet made $100 and someone was like, we're at risk from global warming, how much of our money should we spend? Should we spend $10? Should we spend 50? Should we spend every single penny to try to thwart this? And the most useful way to look at it is, I think, with Bayesian statistics, which is, what are the number of threats that could potentially end the planet, or at least be so damaging that it would set us back, millennia? And you could say, a hot nuclear war would be one, global warming would be another. Right now we're living through the coronavirus pandemic. So obviously, like a horrible contagion, engineered or not, that sweeps through the globe. There's several movies about a giant meteor striking the Earth, which tends to happen once every millennia or so, and that's how the not millennium, but I forget the frequency. It's some number of millions of years. Super volcanoes. There's a lot of different ways that the world could end, and then you have to think about it scientifically and say, what is the likelihood that this is going to happen, and then figure out how do you spend the money in such a way that the risk is mitigated, but not so much that you're wasting the money, which is very hard. There's a great line in Armageddon, which is a fantastically stupid flick that Hollywood came up with, that made oil rig workers the heroes and NASA a bunch of stupid scientists that couldn't figure it out. But the president is like, why didn't we see this big ass rock coming at the Earth? And one of the scientists says, well, we have a lot of telescopes, but begging your pardon, sir, it's a big ass sky, which is a great point. Like it's hard to look everywhere. So all of that to basically ask, is the 235 billion that we've spent so far, do you think it's good that we've spent that much? Should we be spending more? Where are we currently? Like, how safe do you think we are from hot nuclear wars? And then trying to insert that into the geopolitics of a lot of rogue nations really want at least one warhead as a deterrent from coup d'etats, right? So I'm thinking about someone like Gaddafi, who wanted to unify Africa under a gold-backed currency and get away from all the interference. And I can't remember if he was pursuing nuclear power, but certainly everyone else was after he got knocked out, and they were like, wow, this guy complied with everything international powers wanted, and they still got rid of him. But Iran and North Korea, they've been going strong, and it's because I think in part because they have nuclear capacity.
Yes, that's such a rich question, Nick. Thank you. I could riff on a dozen different directions there. I think the first one that I'll come up with there, because you talked about nuclear power, but something which occurred to me there, one of the more zany aspects of ballistic missile defense, which was again spent several $billion on, was something called the airborne laser, which was an idea where you get some AWACS.
What is that?
It's basically, you may have seen them. They're like a 737, but they've got a huge spinning radar disc on the back of them.
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah. And get some of those and strap a laser to the front of them. And what you have is, you could have these planes sort of loitering near the borders of North Korea, just sort of out of international waters, let's say, or international airspace. And what you could potentially do with those is, when the missile takes off, that's when you ideally want to shoot it down, because it's slower and it's got a great big rocket coming out of the bottom of it, which is red hot, and you can see it more easily. So the ideal time to actually shoot the missile down is just after it's taken off. So the idea with the airborne laser was that you would have these AWACS, the acronym just slips my mind there, but the have these 747s loitering near Iran's border, say, and should they launch this missile, the AWACS can pinpoint this laser beam, which was mounted on, kind of, imagine the front of a jumbo jet, this kind of spinning eye, Gorgon's eye, which could spin in 360 degrees. And it fired this pinpoint laser, which was just enough, and this again, coming back to you talking about energy there, just enough to pierce the skin of the missile, was enough to cause it to disintegrate as it got to speed. You know, if you could make a pinprick hole in the side of, you know, something that was actually the size of, literally the size of sort of a full stop, if you could get that into the side of an ICBM,
It's going so fast that the
yeah,
difference in air friction on one side would flip it sideways and
yeah,
totally annihilate it. Yeah.
Yeah. And they managed to do this in tests, but they soon realized that the amount of chemical energy that they needed to have, basically hollow out a 747 and just rack it up with massive batteries in there to get enough chemical energy to power this laser beam. They just realized that it would not be effective, because you can only shoot, so you say you're traveling even at, you know, 37,000 feet, you can only shoot so far before the laser beam sort of fires off over the horizon. Plus it's diffused by aerial interference, you know, just dust and things in the atmosphere diffuses the laser beam. So again, with some of these experimental technologies around ballistic missile defense, they got them to work in practice, but the actual practicalities, sorry, they got them to work in test mode, but the actual practicalities would have been just way too much, way too impractical. So I just throw that in there as a little vignette that I like to throw in, the airborne laser.
I love learning about technologies like that. There was a guy I used to follow. He's pretty crazy on the internet, on Twitter. I can't remember his name now, but he would look at videos from the Middle East and then speculate that there were all these new weapons technologies that we had never heard of because they hadn't been declassified. You know, like these crazy small drones that would fly around and surveil the entire battlefield. One of the ones he talked about, though, were like, I forget the term he used for them. They're not rail guns, they're like hyperkinetic weapons. It's basically a gun on steroids. And so you fire something like a bullet, but I can't remember if it was electromagnetically or chemically, but it did something like it was so fast that it was I don't know, 10 times faster than a bullet, or 100 times. It was crazy fast.
Yeah.
And so you didn't need that much mass, and it would totally annihilate anything that was in front of it. And because it's going so fast, you could hit targets from very far away.
Mm.
You didn't actually need explosives on the end of it, just the sheer force would. So I'm wondering if you've heard of any other crazy technologies like the laser on an airplane that people have proposed that either didn't work or might work or haven't been explored yet.
Well, one that I can, which is a pretty crazy one, which is actually existing extant right now, is the X-band radar, which is basically just a very, very high frequency radar which you can use to track incoming missiles very precisely. You know, that's fairly ordinary, but what they've done with ballistic missile defense is they strap these basically to oil rig bases, and they drag them all around the world, and it's the most bizarre looking thing. Imagine you've seen them, these huge radar domes that look like a giant golf ball, just strapped onto an oil rig base, and they tow it around the world where they need it. So, for example, I believe a few years ago, again, this is a bit out of my area of study, but when things flared up with North Korea, the Americans, towed one of these to sort of in between, into the sea, between Japan and North Korea, give that refined tracking capability. So that's another bizarre one. But definitely the airborne laser is one of the more exotic ends of ballistic missile defense, which was, it basically was deemed that the money was better spent on more tried and tested technologies.
I think it would be really, so when the US dropped 2 nukes on Japan, the entire world changed. And
Yes.
I'm wondering how the game would change if someone did do a first strike, one of these rogue nations launched a nuke, and we took it out within like less than 5 minutes. And it could be with these missile defense. In my mind, one really arrogant technological trick you could do would be to somehow have a missile that detonated an EMP in front of the missile so it no longer had its little computer brain, and then basically somehow chemically ended the rocket or just waited for it to, somehow you capture the missile and don't let it disintegrate, and then you would decommission it and take out all the nuclear fuel and then put it into a nuclear reactor and be like, not only did you not nuke us, but thank you for the extra, we just powered New York for another year. And how demoralizing that would be to someone who had spent a lot of time working on developing nuclear capacity for a rogue state.
Yeah, no, that's really key. And linking back to the question that you asked before, I know you're interested in game theory, and what comes up in a lot of, there's a whole strategic background to ballistic missile defense, just like there is in game theory and nuclear weapons. But one of the terms that comes up time and again in regards to ballistic missile defense is what's called opportunity cost, which is, what is the cost of me building this system versus just pumping out cheap missiles? Okay, and this is where ballistic missile defense we will never be able to, the cat's out of the bag on this. It would never be able to defend against Russia, let's say, or even China. Once you look into the hundreds, it's just easier to, it costs the aggressor much less to pump out a nuclear missile ICBM than it is to develop more and more interceptors. So unless you can keep, unless the aggressor is a small nuclear state like North Korea, ballistic missile defense is basically useless. Although it does complicate the attack for the enemy, because let's say Russia wanted to attack the United States, and Russia, even if we're thinking about between 1997 and 2010, let's say they've got 2,000 nuclear missiles, and the US is able to shoot down, let's say, 12 of them, right? So you've managed to save 12 United States cities. And then Russia does not have a nuclear missile. It actually did. I won't get lost in that, but it did have a really rudimentary one from the 1960s, just protecting Moscow. which is another fascinating story in itself. But then, okay, so the United States has been devastated by an attack from Russia, but it's still got 16 cities that have survived, and it just launches all its arsenal against Russia, who have no missile defense apart from this one crappy Soviet thing from the 1960s, which moved around on bloody cogs to try and orientate itself, and just, you know, wipe out the Soviet Union. So even in that case, a major nuclear weapon state like the Soviet Union would have to calculate that in its attack.
Right, right.
There would be a response from the United States that would have.
This reminds me of a biological theory called the Red Queen hypothesis, which is basically the sort of hyper accelerated evolution between viruses and the immune system, or predator-prey dynamics, where there's so much competition between the two that it forces it's so in the idea is when Alice in Wonderland comes to the Red Queen, they're running really fast under this tree, and after a few minutes they sort of collapse into the same place and they realize they haven't gotten anywhere, and Alice is like, what's going on? And the Red Queen says, oh, well, here you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. And so that sort of, in my mind, is what is going on between the defense offense capabilities of not just nuclear armament. I think nuclear warheads are, I don't have any data to show this, but I think that we probably have weapons that make more sense to use besides nuclear warheads. And I don't know that they actually exist, but when you think about what you can do with computer systems and attacking software, and the potential of, you know, if we have any of those, have you heard of rods from God?
Yes.
You know, sticking these titanium rods up in space and then dropping them with the force of a nuclear explosion, but with no fallout. We might have just evolved past the point where nuclear warheads make sense. You know, there was this theory that Israel probably has the capacity with its military and software, where all warfare now is somewhat more asymmetric. It's not fought between soldiers and combatants in trenches. It's, you know, it's economic warfare. It's intelligence warfare. It's very shadowy. And you know, if Israel got into a real conflict with Iran, would it nuke Iran, or would it just figure out the few people in charge that were persuading Iran to get into military action and attack those few people in a very isolated way, like waging war on equipment and capacity, rather than, it used to be war is like whoever killed more people than the other side won. But I don't think we fight war that way anymore. It's like, for instance, in how would you call it, with an insurgency, like the US really got embarrassed in Vietnam, in the Middle East, because we had all this capacity and nowhere to point it, because the enemy combatants did not wear a uniform, which falls outside the Geneva Conventions. But like, what do you think they were gonna do? They can't fight toe to toe with the US. We dropped Baghdad in less than a week. Like, so of course they're gonna fight this weird, you know, battle, this like psychological warfare combined with sort of terrorist acts. And anytime you hit a camp and kill a bunch of leaders, if you hit civilians, you make martyrs out of them, and you inspire the next generation to sort of pick up the mantle. You know, warfare 3.0, I think, is not going to involve nukes. It's going to involve, psychologically, how do you convince the population that you're fighting against that they shouldn't be fighting anymore? And then the few hardliners, how do you make them ineffective by either knocking out all equipment that they could use. And if they're really, really fundamentalist, you might have to kill them, but how do you kill them in such a way that no one's going to pick up the gun that they dropped, right?
Or just coming back to your point there, go one step further, make it so you don't have to even have to kill them, so they just give up. And this is part of ballistic missile defense, in particularly with what were called rogue states, under Bush. And the idea was that by developing ballistic missile defense, the United States and its allies, like the United Kingdom, would be able to preserve their freedom to intervene in these states should they start to threaten allies. So, for example, if, let's say, Iraq had developed a handful of nuclear weapons and threatened to bomb Israel, let's say. Well, for a start, those kind of things were threatened in the first Gulf War with chemical weapons, and the United States threatened that if you use chemical weapons against our troops, we will nuke Baghdad.
Right.
And of course, they didn't. But let's say, ballistic missile defense was in place. It completely renders useless and you've spent a load of money on it, and you've wasted all your time and all your money, and we can just shoot it down. We don't even have to do anything. We'll just intercept whatever you do, and you've spent all this effort trying to make these weapons.
Right. So I want to talk about. I would assume that anyone in indie thinkers has pretty high decoupling capacity. High decoupling was a term I learned when Richard Dawkins got in trouble on Twitter, because he said, obviously, the ethics and morality of eugenics are beyond the pale. I'm not arguing that point. That's different from saying that in practice it wouldn't work. And he got in a lot of trouble because people were like, "Oh my God, you're pro eugenics," and he's like, "Did you not even read the first part of my?" I just pulled it out of the moral. I'm just saying that if you applied the same techniques that for instance, dog breeding, that's eugenics does work. It's just it's a term that's so loaded that people got upset. And someone wrote a brilliant essay about why he got in trouble. First of all, don't argue points on Twitter, where your limit is 270 characters. But the other was like, people are very, very different personality-wise. And people that are scientists tend to be highly disagreeable and high decouplers. They can analyze problems outside of the emotional, very detached or very, unemotional, just analyzing it logically. But other people, and these people tend to be very compassionate, empathetic, agreeable, great people. They're what's called low decouplers. It's like you can't talk about eugenics without feeling the entire weight of how morally culpable not just the Germans were during World War II, but we don't like to talk about it, but America had a eugenics program. There are a lot of people who were very pro-Nazi and what they were doing before World War II. They were like, of course we should have sterilization camps for the mentally deficient and give tax breaks to beautiful, intelligent people, and penalize people for reproducing if they're not. I mean, people don't like to talk about this, but not Red Cross, not Planned Parenthood. Some founder, I can't remember her name.
Margaret Sanger.
What did she start? Did she start Planned Parenthood or
something like that? Yeah.
I forget. Someone who proposed that birth control was a good idea and should be spread around had pro-eugenic ideology, which we don't like to talk about at all because it's very uncomfortable. Where was I going with this? Oh, I wanted to ask you if you're a high decoupler, and then I had a follow-up question. So yes, you can examine ideas without setting aside the moral implications for a second. Oh, God damn it. I went so far off on this tangent that I forgot where I was going with this. What were you talking about? Bombing Baghdad?
Yeah, the idea that if you have, well, no, it was a threat that the United States government made
Oh,
to.
I remember what I wanted to say. So when Trump got into Twitter beef with Kim Jong on North Korea, little Rocket Man, which is hilarious. Obviously, Trump is a very divisive figure, and it's very difficult for people to uncouple him from the implicit whatever morality that I don't want to get into it. But someone brought up the point that if you could convince North Korea that going nuclear was the worst idea possible, and that by giving up nukes, if there was some way to come to them and say, if you give up nukes, not only will you be under the protection of just China, which they have a weird relationship right now, but the China, US, and Russia, all three will sort of put North Korea in their sphere of influence. And it'll be sort of a standoff where, not any one power is manipulating the other. And it's basically got three big brothers that are going to prevent anyone from screwing with it too badly. And you brought North Korea into the fold of the world economy.
Yeah.
The amount of benefit to North Korea was such that it no longer made sense for them to develop nukes. And I think that someone argued quite passionately that this is why Kim Jong-un's dad developed nukes as a negotiating token. Tell me what you tell, someone said, don't build nukes. And then they were building nukes. And then they said, okay, what do you want for you to give up this program? And they said, we want you to end the economic sanctions. We want you to do X, Y, Z, whatever. I think there's a game, some game strategist could figure out a way that you get the Kim Jong-uns out of there. You can't, I don't think, prosecute them, even though they're horrible and have done all these crimes. You would just have to put them on an island somewhere.
Go and live in they could go and live in Saudi Arabia.
So yeah, somewhere where they're not going to get assassinated. And then North and South Korea reunify, which is going to take a long, long time and a lot of healing from the damage that's done. But people forget, like, there's families that were split by the war you could slowly reintroduce, like, how do you, it reminds me of that Daryl Davis is a black jazz musician who goes to KKK meetings to try to deconvert these crazy people who have grown up in this sort of cycle of hatred. And he's gotten like 200 people to leave these horrible groups just by sitting down and talking to them at the diner. Someone has to figure out a way to get Iran and North Korea to basically join the rest of the world and say, you got to stop doing this. There's so much potential benefits to, like, yeah. I don't know. I imagine Trump and Kim Jong-un sitting down and talking, and Trump is like, you like McDonald's? We can build you a McDonald's in North Korea. Come on. Wouldn't you like that a little bit?
Well, I think the ballistic missile defense is part of that bargain.
Right. It's another token on the board.
And you mentioned Gaddafi earlier. Now, I don't really study the Gaddafi era, but from some of my research, I do recall that Gaddafi kind of stood down his nuclear program. Yes, after the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, but also at least people in the House of Commons, etc., on the select committees, which are a bit like the US version of congressional hearings, believed that it was partly due to the US's ballistic missile defense program. that this, you know, if this was in Europe and it was NATO-ized, who the hell is Gaddafi going to be able to fire this at? And they're mostly kind of a desert-bound country. You know, where are they going to get all this money from, apart from oil, to try and fund this project? And that was another string to the bow of them giving up on their nuclear program.
I mean, the last move for a rogue state, you know, imagining a perfect ballistic missile defense program, is to not launch the nukes, but just to self-detonate and threaten the populace of the, like, someone that's so crazy that they're like, I'm going to kill myself and everyone in this country if you don't give in to what I want. That is hard to defend against, but it requires, I think, a certain mind that is extremely rare. And in that case, we would do something sneakier and clever, like this. Have you heard of the Stuxnet worm?
I've heard of it, yes.
Oh my gosh. I talked to someone who was majoring in computer science, and I was like, have you heard of the Stuxnet worm? And they were like, no. And I was like, go read everything you can. This is the craziest computer virus ever engineered. So for those that don't know, Iran was trying to purify uranium with these centrifuges that kept failing. And all of them failed in very strange way. I mean, like, when centrifuges, they spin so fast that if you unbalance them, I mean, they basically explode into a tiny 1,000 fragments. So the Stuxnet worm was this crazy exploit that no one has claimed responsibility, but it was probably a collaboration between the US and Israel that, like, I'm not going to remember the exact details, but it was like, you know, someone was playing, you know, Pokemon Gold, and then connected, and it somehow, you know, got into like a USB on a computer that then infected the hardware of these centrifuges that no one realized what was happening. It was like, it was like a Rube Goldberg machine of beautiful computer corruption. It was like somehow infecting the hardware chip that all of the centrifuges were built on, and it decimated like a fifth of Iran's centrifuges. And I just imagine these scientists try to purify uranium, which I don't know how it works, but centrifuging is not a difficult thing. As a biologist, I do it all the time, and they all keep failing. They're like, why is this? We balanced it perfectly. So definitely read up on that. But this is what I go to when I say that warfare is being fought more asymmetrically, and I think nukes are a little bit outdated, even though everyone's still afraid of them. That the ballistic missile defense, I think I agree. I don't know if 235 billion is the right amount to spend. That's sort of a tricky question, but I do think it's important that we have it. And the hope is that in my lifetime or my sister's lifetime, that it'll become another antiquated form of warfare. That it'll go the way of the sword and shield. You know, a beautiful step along the path of, like, using nuclear weapons is like getting into a fist fight with someone in a telephone booth and deciding to use a hand grenade. It's like total, like, you wipe out. Yeah. Anyways,
no,
it's too much. You wipe out the entire city and the population, and you irradiate the earth so that nothing can grow there.
Yeah.
Like, you can't even bomb an entire country with nukes and then move in and take over the country, because you've effectively salted the earth. Like,
it's the ultimate dick move.
It's the ultimate dick move. Yes, it is the ultimate dick move. It's like, I don't know if you've ever read, there's a very popular video game when I was growing up, Halo, and Halo 2 and Halo 3. It was a very popular shoot 'em up game, but they fight these aliens in space that have the power to, like, shoot plasma at planets, which they call glassing the planet. They, like, melt everything so it turns into glass, and then they move on. And I was like, that is a horrible way to disintegrate a spacefaring. Like, you can't even move in and take over and use the resources. You've effectively turned, this planet into a useless marble.
Mm.
So yeah, speaking of dick moves and in terms of warfare.
No, but just coming back to what you were saying there about terrorist organizations. I mean, the only, if you read a lot of the literature from the United States and sort of how they were strategizing this in the Department of Defense, etc., the only groups that they said would not respond to the logic of ballistic missile defense are suicidal terrorist groups. So they were very concerned that what if Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda back then, managed to topple the government of Pakistan, get hold of the nukes, and then just decide to launch them because they're suicidal anyway. They don't care about the integrity of the state. They don't care about any of that. They want an apocalyptic war. And ballistic missile defense would not matter to them. I mean, it might shoot down some of the incoming missiles, but some of them would get through. Whereas someone like Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un today, you could think that they at least want to survive.
They're semi-rational. They might not be rational in a conventional, Western person. How would you describe it? They're different culturally, but they're not fanatics, right? They're brutally oppressive to their population in a way that's morally reprehensible to us and to most people. But if you apply pressure in the right places, they still respond to incentives and disincentives, carrot and stick, which is what I joked about. You in one hand offer a McDonald's in the capital of North Korea, and in the other hand, you have the power to capture any nuke they send and then put it in your own nuclear power plant as the ultimate fuck you. Kim Jong-un might respond to that, but someone who has been thoroughly radicalized, hypnotized in the mind. It's almost like a mind virus. These really crazy, I'm not saying everyone who's religious is possessed by a mind virus, but anyone who is willing to not only blow themselves up, but blow up to blow up a civilian population or nuke themselves or nuke someone else is just ethically compromised in a way that I can't really understand. And I don't have a good way of like deconverting those people. There are a few other people who, I think Sam Harris is friends with someone, I can't remember his name, but who, when he was a young man, got radicalized through the internet, joined a terrorist group, and then found his way back out in some way, and now works to de-radicalize young people. All that to say, Al-Qaeda is very scary, but they're not entirely rational.
No.
Because if they really wanted to do damage, they wouldn't be blowing themselves up in markets and killing 70 civilians. They would target the electrical system, or they would detonate an EMP on Wall Street and, wipe out all the bits that we now count as our currency. There's ways that are much more damaging than the methods they employ, but their methods are very psychologically damaging. Yeah, I don't have a tangent to go with that. So,
this is talking about Al-Qaeda. I mean, one of the tangents which the United States was gaming for and thought that this ballistic missile defense could have some efficacy here was right. So how would ISIS, sorry, not ISIS, Al-Qaeda, if we're talking about the area that I'm studying, how would they actually get a nuclear bomb into New York, let's say? Well, are they gonna try and ship it through customs or something like that? That's a bit dodgy. They're gonna get caught out. Okay, so what if they were to purchase a nuclear missile from North Korea or something like that, hide it inside a converted shipping crate on a boat that they've bought, get it sort of international waters, just in international waters outside New York, and then launch it on New York from there. That would have been some option that they could have done. Now, whether ballistic missile defense would have been able to intercept that in that time, probably not. So the only thread which the Americans and the British thought about that was, well, if they've had to buy that weapon from someone, if we can find out who that person is, we will obliterate them. So they're not going to dare sell a nuclear weapon to Al-Qaeda.
Right.
What's also good about nuclear weapons and especially ballistic missiles is you need a state to build them. You can't be a bunch of terrorists out in the desert knocking bits of metal together to make a missile. I mean, one of the ironies is it actually seems more difficult to build the missile than it is to build the nuclear bomb. Especially if
Right, exactly. Yeah. So that's what a lot of people are worried about, something like a dirty bomb, which don't have the explosive capacity as like a full, intercontinental ballistics missile. But if you eliminate the rocket and you reduce the purification requirements, and you just have a tiny bit of uranium that isn't even very purified, and you figured out a way to detonate that, and maybe instead of like a 2-mile radius, it's a few city blocks, that would be something that could be hid in a backpack. I mean, I grew up and 9/11 happened when I was quite young, so I don't really remember it. I remember it from a childhood sort of memory, and then looking back, like how it affected everyone. People back in the day used to think that there were like missiles on the White House and the Pentagon, or that we would be able to scramble jets and land planes if they got hijacked. And it doesn't seem like any of those systems were in place, or if they were, they just weren't. There was a great clip on the old Opie and Anthony show where they were talking about what the hell happened to the national the emergency sound system. Like it used to be, there were these like big megaphones, and when there was like a risk of like a hurricane, or they would like cut out all of the TV channels to say, we have an important emergency announcement, this is not a drill or whatever. None of those cut on. So they're like, did all of that just disappear? Like what happened? We still had Nickelodeon playing the Jeffersons, in the middle of these two airplanes striking the Twin Towers. It was very strange. So I don't know. Do you think that the ballistic missile defense, to my knowledge, they've never been used effectively, correct?
Not the ballistic missile defense. No, I mean,
do they test them like yearly? Like, how do they make sure that everything is? Is real?
I can't speak so much to what's currently happening, but in the era that I sort of look at, from 97 to 2010, by about 2004, they'd managed to get the tests to work several times, like several dozen times. Okay. So they've got the system in place, but ballistic missile defense to shoot down ICBMs coming from other countries has never been tried in practice. So whether it would work in practice is another thing. I mean, if we're talking about countermeasures, you talked about your ballistic missile defense, sort of capturing them. There are other things that the offense can do. I mean, in space, because there is no friction or obviously no weight, what countries could do is to confuse a ballistic missile interceptor is they could just, and this is something that the Soviets developed sort of in the Cold War as well, that you can just have inflatable warheads that kind of give off the same signature. It's the bizarrest thing. So a nuclear warhead looks like a black cone. Mm-hmm. And what would happen is you would have your one warhead, and then within the sort of, when the nose cone comes off and your warhead comes out, you have several dozen or a few dozen of these inflatable warheads that just look like and have the sort of radar signature of the interceptor
tracks.
Yeah. And all kinds of other little things. Sorry, I was going off the point there. What was your main question there, Nick?
Good question. I just wanted to touch back on Red Queen theory. Like, You developed a missile defense, you're gonna, the next step would be the people building the missiles to build in a bunch of imposter missiles.
Mm.
Suddenly it's impossible to figure out which one's the right one.
Mm.
Um,
I remember what the point was. It was something like, would this work in practice? Now,
oh, that's right.
ballistic missile defense has never been tried in practice, in reality. Let's say it's been tried a lot and it's been made to work. But there are many different layers of missile defense which aren't technically called ballistic missile, because the term ballistic missile means that the rocket has fired it out of the atmosphere and it's sort of just falling on its trajectory like a thrown ball.
Right.
Whereas what you've got sort of in war theaters, you have called theater defense, which is where you might have cruise missiles or other what are called air breathing missiles, which continue with their rocket power or however they're powered. And that's been tried, that's been tested and worked many times, going way back to the First Gulf War with the Patriot missiles. And many countries have those kind of systems and they work. So you've got this layered defense, ballistic missile defense being the highest layer. And then you've got theater defense, which is to defend your troops on the ground or cities, let's say. And then you have point defense, which is, individual ships that can sort of defend themselves against things.
Right.
But if you're trying to defend against an ICBM, theater and point defense is not capable of intercepting it because it's traveling too fast, because it's basically dropping from space.
Right.
Another point that I just wanted to come back to, you mentioned about the rods from God.
Yes.
So, I mean,
are those real or are they theoretical?
Well, no, they're theoretical, because one of the main things is, and I'll unpack this a little bit, is it's not possible under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, it's not possible to place weapons in space. It's possible to fire
any weapons or
no weapons. So it's
okay.
possible to fire weapons from one country into another and pass through space, but you are not allowed to have weapons in space that fire down to the floor.
So what happens if someone violates that treaty?
Well, if someone was to try, and that would cause a major ruckus, and it would cause a major wave of proliferation. So just to back off from missile defense a minute, this is something that the Russians were really suspicious about the United States.
The space race?
Yeah, the space race, and particularly, oh God, I can't remember this.
I remember when Sputnik went around the globe, it freaked Americans out so badly, because it was almost like Russia flaunting, like, we can hit you from anywhere now. And it was outwardly non-militaristic. JFK, that great speech, we choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And I think the US, not to go off on too much to a separate issue, but that was a beautiful time in US history, sending a man to the moon with the computational power of a singing birthday card. And I really wish that we had some of that. If you believe in American exceptionalism, putting a man on the moon is about the highlight of that sort of thing. It's doing something outrageous and seemingly impossible and making it work through science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Obviously I'd pick the space race instead of building a nuclear weapon, which is similar American exceptionalism, but not in a way that I'm very fond of. I don't know. We've had other politicians declare, like, I don't know how much he believes in it, but Elon Musk saying that we should build a colony on Mars and become, multiplanetary. That is a way to spend money that acts as a backup against certain world-ending catastrophes. Like if an asteroid hit the Earth, but we had expanded enough on Mars that we could come back and resettle Earth, super virus, something like that. Yeah, the Mars thing. I think Joe Biden said he announced the moonshot for curing cancer. Like, we want to cure all cancer. That's the type of thing that I get very excited about, that America has somewhat forgotten how to do. What was I saying though before this?
We were talking about the rods from God, etc.
Oh yeah, breaking the treaty. So I know
Mm.
we have all these treaties about non-nuclear proliferation. Could someone get a rod of God into space without anyone else noticing?
Well, yeah, I mean, theoretically, that anyone could kind of do that. Whether it would work very well would be, a bit of a moot point. It could the North Koreans try and do something like that? Well, yes, they could, but it'd be a major escalation.
I
Um,
don't think the North Koreans could do it, but I don't know.
no,
Could the US send up a satellite and be like, oh, it's a communication satellite, but it has these, how big are they supposed to be? They're like big tungsten rods, right?
yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the technical side of that, but just coming back to that earlier point, this is what the Russians feared about the space shuttle. They thought, why the hell are the United States spending so much money on this thing? It's got massive cargo doors. What are they going to put on this?
Gotcha.
This caused them to try and develop their own, which I believe was called Energia. But anyway, that fell through. But just grounding this a little bit more in ballistic missile defense and the Outer Space Treaty, if the United States was, if Trump was just to say, right, we're going to put these weapons in space, Russia would just say, right, we're doing that too. Solve the Outer Space Treaty.
Right.
So the only thing, when you've got these countries that are so powerful that nothing can
An
rein them
arms race.
is they just go into an arms race. But they don't, even though there's tensions between Russia and America, and during the 90s and during now, it's nothing like during the Cold War. It's nothing like that.
Well, so that's why people that are intelligent and know a lot about artificial intelligence are praying that we can sign some sort of treaty that says, can we not try to use AI in military? They're trying to look ahead and say, like, that's like when, I forget who, but someone proposed that if you're going to study viruses, you can't do any experiments that include gain of function. Gain of function means like you take a virus that infects, I don't know, lizards or something, and you go, oh, if I swap the spike protein out for one in I don't know, HIV, can I get it to infect human cells? Yeah, don't do that experiment. Like obviously you can take viruses and make them more virulent and probably deadlier. But why would you do that? Like just don't fuck with viruses like that. Try to figure out if you can use them to deliver genetic payloads and cure some of these horrible genetic diseases that are going around. Don't see if you can get them to infect human cells. It's just such a dumb idea. So I know, Elon Musk and not Jack Ma, someone, there are a few people that study AI that are just like, can we not do the human thing that everyone knows that we're going to do and turn this into a weapon? It's a really bad idea. Um, I have my fingers crossed that China, Russia, US, Israel, EU can agree and say, yeah, let's not. Um, but my suspicion is that someone is developing it in secret, and then someone else finds out, and then they start developing it in secret, and it's going to be an underground arms race. You really just need someone that can take top secret national military, secrets, and then blast them in a in a newsroom, not a newsroom. What do they call it? Like a press meeting. China, stop developing AI weapons.
Terrifying stuff.
Anyways,
Terrifying stuff.
yeah.
I just wanted to come back to one point. You've raised game theory quite a lot, and it does link back to ballistic missile defense. But also, we've talked about rationality a lot. One of the things that I always question about game theory and warfare is it tends to assume that warfare is the ultimate rational calculation. Am I going to win or lose? But to me, it can't be that, because one side loses. So one side
Right.
was was irrational in its calculation. So
It's people playing a zero-sum game. But I think that that's like when you see people on Twitter and they're like, billionaires shouldn't exist. They think that wealth is zero sum. And many people that are billionaires, a lot of it's inherited. That's fine. Your dad was an oil tycoon and you passed on. But a lot of these people invented a company and a majority of their wealth is in stocks, which people don't really understand. I don't even understand how stocks work or the stock market. It's very confusing. I don't understand how you can trade on the predictive value of something in the future and predict it by a few milliseconds and then ping information all around the globe, and you make a huge transaction and make a lot of money or lose a lot of money. It's not even money at that point. It's fishy digits. Like,
and then you bring in
but
Bitcoin.
yeah, there's speaking of fishy digits, I'm very interested about cryptocurrency as a currency that is, if we're not going to go back to the gold standard and making your money, valuing your money based on debt is a pretty dumb idea. What is the next thing going to be? Well, if you have a currency that's uncontrollable by governments, that's decentralized and secure, those are big asks. It seems like that would be a useful way to go. Either that or just go back to barter and trade. Like, you got a chicken? Cool. I got a sandwich. Let's trade.
There's another nuclear war. Who knows?
Might go. Yeah, something about like World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
I think it's Einstein. I'm not sure.
Yeah, something like that. If you can change the frame of warfare from zero sum, killing 100% of a population, glassing a country or planet, to changing a win-lose or lose-lose situation. I mean, that's what what's it, mutually assured destruction. You've turned warfare somehow into a win-lose game, into a lose-lose game. Congratulations, you went backwards. But that had the effect of saying like, okay, no one's going to shoot the first missile. So if you can, people are still figuring out how to make it win-lose, like all the superpowers. But if you can somehow change the parameters of the game to be win-win and we'll leave all of this petty shit behind, we could do so much good for the planet instead of putting all of our resources into secret AI programs or rods from God. I mean, obviously it's not practical because no one solved human psychology and there's something intrinsic about human nature that we're very competitive and tribal. But somehow, I don't know, we need the equivalent of the mission to the moon for human wisdom and compassion. And I don't know how you do that, because we have, if we keep increasing our ability to blow ourselves up without increasing our capacity for wisdom or intelligence, or a way to say like, I don't know, warfare is just not useful anymore. There's some science fiction novel that I read about where instead of playing with actual bombs, two countries would play with their smartest players and they would play a computer game and they would hypothetically bomb cities. And if a building got bombed, rather than actually bombing it, they would just lead out all of the people living in that building to go get killed somewhere, but leave the building intact. Because in this particular sci-fi world, they're like, well, we want to leave the underlying infrastructure in place. And it was so dark, but in a very rational way of like, they were so close to like, yes, leave the underlying infrastructure intact, but also leave the people intact. You're one step below where we need to get to make this shit totally irrelevant.
I think that, you know, if you were to ask me what is my actual opinion on ballistic missile defense, you know, leading on from what you've just said, you know, when I first started researching this, my mind was very much of the opinion that, okay, so this seems like a colossal waste of money. Surely this should be spent on human development in the third world, etc. And of course, that would be great. But I do think that with ballistic missile defense, it is possible, and it has been possible, for countries to reduce their nuclear arsenal. Because certainly, you know, the allied countries, the NATO countries, you know, none of them actually want to have nuclear weapons. The argument is we want to go for multilateral nuclear disarmament. If we can, you know, convince Russia and China to go along with it, we will get our missiles down as far as we can. And for example, Russia and America, the missiles are the lowest they've been since God knows, you know, the 1950s. It's roughly about 1,000 each, which is from a high of 40,
Really?
yeah, 40,000 plus during the height of the Cold War each.
Right.
So for
ICBMs, you mean?
ICBMs, yeah. So to go
Wow.
from 40,000 plus each to 1,000 or so each is a massive, massive development. And ballistic missile defense, you know, plays a role in that.
Now, how do you know the numbers of the missiles? Because obviously it's strategically detrimental to tell the other team, like, we have missile launchers here, here, and here. Is it possible that someone's like, oh yeah, I only have 1,000, but they really have 2,000 and they're like hidden somewhere else?
Well, there's always that trust problem, but
This is a prisoner's dilemma, but instead of playing on jail time, you're playing with the fate of the world. It's a tricky problem.
No, it absolutely is. It absolutely is a problem of whether you know, the countries are actually telling, let's just keep it to Russia and the USA because they have the sort of, you know, the non-proliferation treaties, etc., with each other, strategic arm relation treaty, etc. And they have to have a degree of trust. Now, I believe they're supposed to be able to corroborate each other's data, but again, you don't know whether the data could be, you know, the stockpile data, etc. I'm not going to say that they're allowed to inspect each other's missile sites, because I don't want to say something that I'm not 100% sure of. I'm not sure whether that's actually the case, actually, whether the United States and Russia are allowed to send inspection teams to their various silos, check that they have the numbers that they have.
But you could predict that the amount of money it costs to upkeep nukes is pretty expensive. And they haven't been used in forever. I mean, the last time that they were threatened to be used was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think in Korea, MacArthur was like, just nuke the northern border between China and just cut off that we won't have any interference from them. And someone was like, I might be misremembering my history, but someone was like, yeah, you can't just like use nukes as a wall.
Yeah.
So if nobody's using them and mutually assured destruction is sort of preventing people from using them outside of rogue states, it makes sense for at least the superpowers to disarm as increase for spending for warfare in other areas goes up. Like, I don't know, 4 decades ago, the amount of money spent on computer software hackers was zero. I'm sure that's somewhere in the millions. The entire NSA, you know, billions and millions of dollars spent on all these electrical systems. That's where I'm assuming, if you assume the budget is sort of zero sum, less and less money is going to go for the upkeep to the nukes, and more is going to go up to the new forms of warfare, which I hypothesize, as you look at violence in the human species over time, it is decreasing linearly. Fewer and fewer wars are being fought. You know, World War II was definitely a peak. World War One. Hopefully we seem to have a lot of these proxy wars that are like, the Middle East has been shit forever and all this other stuff, but I might be too optimistic, but it seems to me that it is becoming increasingly clear, the more interconnected and globalized we become, how much war damages not only your quote unquote enemies, but also yourself. And that it's not it's not zero sum in the way it used to be. Like coronavirus has shown us how screwed and impossible it is for any of us to live individually and isolationist. Like the fact that we've shipped all our manufacturing over to China and then we shut down the global economy, and the US is like, we can't make vitamin C anymore, like basic stuff. So yeah, warfare is going out of fashion, damaging to everyone. I'm hoping that there exist existential problems that affect everyone equally on the globe that we can collaborate with to fight against, like warfare, but this is basically what Watchmen said. You know, Ozymandias blew up all these cities with Dr. Manhattan blue stuff and then made him the bad guy, and then Russia and the US came together to fight him. But if we could pick a target, like global warming is sort of hard to visualize. You know, cancer might be one, or education, or I really like space travel because people really enjoy science fiction and it's sort of easily to visualize. Um, Another one that's very humanist but also very arrogant and sort of impossible is like if you picked the concept of death and you said, I don't think this is natural. I think we can figure out a way to beat death. And you just collaborated people to work on, you know, longevity medicine or ways to at least extend lifespan. The potential upside to life extension and planetary travel and, you know, developing really cheap energy for everyone. If you change the parameters of the game so that it becomes not just a win-win, but a super massive win-win, then all of these dumb games become antiquated and we can leave them in the past. Like so much conflict because of the petrodollar. But if you went to these oil companies and somehow figured out a way to say like, figure out how to a way to make nuclear energy work on a global scale, you know, it's different than how you currently make money, but you know, you'll become gazillionaires and change the parameters of the game where it's like you could own some of the energy resources of not just this planet but of the next few planets that we go and you know, terraform and colonize. Suddenly these petty squabbles about who owns the oil wells in Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or whatever are just sort of like relegated to the dustbin of history.
In talking about these big meta level issues, I mean, just to riff on a little bit, what you're saying there, I mean, one of the things that terrifies me more than nuclear war, hopefully because of the systems that are in place that we've been talking about, is antibiotic resistance. That freaking scares me, the idea that we could go back to a world in which antibiotics don't work anymore.
That's why they made antibacterial soap illegal. Someone, I don't know if this is a proposal that actually passed, but it was like, yeah, don't stick antibiotics in every fucking hand soap you use. You're like creating MRSA everywhere. This is an issue that's close to my heart because antibiotics, I don't understand the bioeconomics of it, but it's not very profitable. There's been a lot of companies that have tried to find new antibiotics, but they've all folded. Ginkgo just acquired a company called Warp Drive Bio that's looking for natural product pathways in different species, like a lot of streptomyces. And they've done some computational work to figure out predictively which ones tend to code for types of antibiotics to try to find ones that work. But I think that antibiotics are going to become an antiquated technology soon. I don't know how yet, but you don't want broad spectrum antibiotics because it kills all your gut flora and fauna. What you want is a medicine that destroys only the bacteria that you care about. And so there was a presentation I attended at the Experimental Biology Conference in 2017, I believe. Interesting conference. There's only a few synthetic biology talks. Very interesting. this guy from MIT, whose name I don't remember, but there are viruses that are extremely specific for certain types of bacteria, phages. So there's a phage that's very specific for E. coli. There's a phage, and you picture there's 10 billion bacteria, there's like 10 trillion viruses, and they all have different ways of injecting their little non-alive machinery into cells and getting replicated. And he was figuring out a way to engineer viruses by swapping out either the spike protein, I forget what type of phages he was using, whatever the mechanism is for recognizing certain type of cells. He did experiments where, given a culture of 3 different bacteria, could you kill one of them and leave the other 2 intact? And he was demonstrating that you could take a phage and convert it from its original host that it normally uses to a different one, because essentially it's using the same machinery, ribosomes and whatnot, to replicate. If you swap out the recognition machinery, you could get it to recognize other bacteria. And I think Russia has a big freezer somewhere in Siberia full of a bunch of viruses that they used as antibiotics way back in the day. It's not a very popular technique, but you can do something like that. Then there's another technology called, they're like antibiotic peptides. They're very weird. I don't understand the mechanism, but somehow you get these really short, it's not a full protein. They're like 17 amino acid peptide chains that somehow have antibacterial activity. But they're finding ways using directed evolution techniques to figure out ones that pop particular cells. So not to say that we shouldn't keep looking for other antibiotics, but I think we've picked all the low-hanging fruit, and the remaining ones are going to be extremely difficult. And they still have the underlying problem of like stability, bioavailability. A lot of them you can't really touch very well with organic chemistry. So that means you're going to have to pull the natural product pathway and put it into a species that's naturally resistant and get it to crank out a lot of the antibiotic and then purify it. So I'm not saying we're done with antibiotics. I'm just saying that I think that the solution to these superbugs are going to be with tech that we haven't fully realized yet. I was reading something about cancer where there's medicine that was looking at cancer, and instead of trying to kill it, get it to differentiate into a different cell type. So get it to go from a cancer cell to like a random liver cell, and now you don't have cancer anymore. Or like, to take MRSA and instead of combining 7 different antibiotics to kill MRSA, which I don't think that even works. If you could somehow use CRISPR and cut out its antibiotic mechanism, or use like 3 different methods to kill it simultaneously, and it can't really mutate fast enough to develop a defense against all 3. Whereas if you expose it one at a time to different antibiotics, it'll gain the resistance, and then that's it. You're done. You can't use that antibiotic anymore. So interesting ways to look at the problem. The way we currently treat cancer a lot with like radiation and chemotherapy, those are the nukes of healthcare. And I'm hoping that they will go to the wayside as we start moving into, the software hacking, asymmetric warfare of gene therapy and other weird things. Well, on that note, I really have to pee.
Yeah.
Let's take a break here and reconvene in 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Actually, Nick, I was going to suggest that we wrap up.
Okay, we can do that.
Yeah. It's really great talking to you, but I've got to help get my kids ready for bed. So
sure, and thank you for being flexible in the start time. I know we started a little late, but I appreciate it.
No problem. No, Nick, honestly, it's been really great talking to you. This is the first time that I've had someone invite me on the podcast, so that's really kind of you.
I'm glad. I'm surprised. I figured you would have been on a few others, but I remember the first time I got invited on a podcast and being very grateful. So yeah, this was great, James. Listen, I would love to do a follow-up at some point. I feel like, we didn't even touch parts of these paper that are very interesting, but maybe we can talk afterwards and I can attach the paper in the podcast notes, or we'll figure out a time to do part 2.
Yeah, great. That's really good. Cheers, Nick.
All right. Thanks, James. Have a good one. And yeah, we'll talk again soon, and I'll let you know when I'm finished with the editing and we upload this. Okay.
Yeah. Nice. Thanks a lot.
Yep. Take it easy.
Bye.